everyone, welcome to your video on China. I just want to give you a heads up. I am doing this from home. As you can see, there's my art stack back there. But I do have the pugs with me. They have been remarkably annoying today. There is not much I can do on that because pugs are like 4-year-old children and you just have to love them because, you know, they don't listen to anything else. So I'm going to apologize ahead of time if they're naughty. I'm hoping that everybody has just worn themselves out because this is the 4th attempt that I have done with this video because they keep barking. So I'm hoping they're tired and we can go on. Now this particular video is going to talk about ancient China and Confucianism, but we're going to start with ancient China because in order to understand where Confucianism and Taoism, which will be its own video, come from, we have to know that these concepts pre-existed. Whew, so are you ready? Here we go. So the first thing to consider is that ancient China settled along riverbanks, and because they settled along rivers, rivers gave life and death. So they could be giving life-giving water through irrigation and crops, or they gave you death through floods and destruction. So early on, China had a concept of from one thing can come two results. And that's going to be important because eventually that gets looped into the idea of the Tao, which basically means the way, the pathway, unity with the pathway, you know, going with the flow. It's hard to define, but it is kind of this universal, impersonal concept of order. And within the Tao, you have two halves. You have the yin and the yang. So I'm sure you're familiar with the black and white symbol that has really come into pop culture pretty nicely. But the yin and the yang. Yin is the black and yang is the white. Yin represents motherhood, moist, soft, earth, death, shadows, the like, and is usually popularly portrayed as a mother tiger, right? A fierce, powerful, feminine force. The yang is white, you know, heaven, masculine, hard, pushing out, dry, and is essentially the opposite, right? It represents or is represented by the father dragon, the overall heavenly protector. So the yin and the yang cannot exist without the other. So you cannot have male without female. You cannot have black without white. I mean, our world is very much a part of duality. So the heart of one resides in the body of the other. So the body of the black has a spot, the heart of the white, and the body of the white has the heart of the black. So they coexist. It's hard to say that yin and yang are good and evil, and I kind of hesitate with that. I have seen some textbooks that will define it that way. I would really say it's more along the lines of fortune and misfortune. So these ideas of from one thing can come two results. Now, with the yin and yang concept, there are a few other elements of this dichotomy. So the early Chinese started to say, well, if there's heaven and earth, what are we? Well, we are made of the breath of heaven and the clay of the earth, right? So there are within us two souls. One comes from the earth. Our mother eats the food that makes us develop. We live upon the earth and we eat the food upon which we are sustained. And then we die and we return to the earth, then sustaining it and then the next generation. So we are the flesh, the clay, and then we're also the spirit, the life breath. Now you find this with a lot of indigenous religions, this very heavy emphasis on the life breath. But if you think about it, you find it even in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, where, you know, God breathed life into Adam, right? So that life's breath. So when we die, our two souls go into two different locations. The earthbound soul stays with the remains, stays with the body. And in the old days, you used to bury the bodies under your house. You kept your family close to you because that soul was still with the body and it needed to be cared for. The other half of the soul goes up to heaven, all right, up to the heavens. Now, You're going to have to bear with me because I'm going to have to pull a couple of little threads together to get this concept going. But because the ancestors stayed with you, literally, they were under your house, they continue to watch over you. And because they continue to watch over you, you were expected to give homage to the ancestor spirits, all right, because they were with you. The ancestor spirits were also your protection because outside in the spiritual realm, in an animistic world, nature is full of spirits, right? As the Chinese folkloric religion developed, they came up with a concept that the world was like a tiered wedding cake. So you had the plains and the rivers, and then on the next tier you had the hills, and then the next tier you had the mountains, and the next tier you had the clouds, and the top tier you had the constellations, and above all of that deified nature, all of those spirits and gods, at the very top you had Tien, you had the seat of heaven, and in the seat of heaven sat Di, the emperor of the gods, because as above, so below. As humans have a leader who becomes the emperor, and then followers and a bureaucratic system creating a sense of order, so too do the heavens. So because of this, one soul stayed in the earth, the other soul went up to heaven, where it actually served or would report to Di Tian, to God, about your behavior, because Di not only kept the system going, but he was also in charge of doling out fortune and withholding fortune, which basically meant if he had fortune to give out, the one half of your ancestor spirits would go to him and say, oh, please send it to my family. I have consulted with myself, right? Because you have two halves, you have the two souls, they're communicating. And I know my family is doing well. They are honoring their neighbors. They are being good to each other. They have welcomed the stranger. They have worked the land. They work hard, right? Give them fortune. But if you are not behaving, your ancestor spirits are going to be like, yeah, they really don't deserve it. You really should give that fortune to somebody else. Somebody who's more deserving until they learn their lesson. Right? So the ancestor spirits become very important. Not only are they your supernatural defense attorneys against misfortune, they also protect you from other supernatural forces around you. And I love this because if another family's mad at your family, they can send their ancestor spirits to come and get you, and your ancestor spirits actually fight them. It's really cool. But anyway, way beside the point. So the ancestors are important. You would actually have a home shrine built to your ancestor spirits so that you could consult them for important decisions. Should my daughter marry into this family? Should the business do this? And they would answer. Now, I brought this up in part because behind me I have what is supposed to be a spirit house from ancient China, allegedly dating to the 2nd century CE, most likely. I'm rather doubtful on that. It's probably a replica, but it was a gift given to me by my mother, and she got it from somebody who was a world traveler. Now, there are a couple different possibilities with this, but the odds are that it's a replica rather than an original. But remember that when Mao brought communism to China, they really tried to stop a lot of the traditionalism, and they got rid of a lot of their antiquities. So it is always possible that this, went up on the market. But I think it's probably more likely that it is a replica based upon a legitimate spirit house. But I don't know for sure. I've never had it carbon tested because I really don't want to move it out. I do know that it has had some repairs, but you can actually create antiquities that are modern. So you make these things. This is a big deal back in the day. The Greeks, for example, in the 20s and 30s, when the Minoan goddess figure became very popular, they're like, oh, look at this even more ancient culture. And the Greeks are like, ka-ching. And what they would basically do is they would carve these little goddess statues out of stone. They put them in some hydrochloric acid. They might even pour Worcestershire sauce on them to make them look old, and then they bury them in the dirt. And when the tourists were around, they'd be out there plowing their fields, and oh, look what we found, and then piece of antiquity has come up. I can sell it to you. So it does happen, but I love my little spirit house. My mother always told me that, and she still tells me, so she lives next door, so she's still around, but that when she passes away, she's going to come visit me, and this is where she's going to stay. And I keep telling her that I'm going to add blinds and a lock to this window. But essentially what we end up with is, this is probably modeled, or it possibly is, a middle-class house, in part because of the implied stairwell and the second floor window, and then this very intricate rooftop design. So this would be something for the for the middle class. You would also have to honor your ancestor spirits at feasts. Food was always set aside for them. They would eat first. And even at the tombs, you would have little dishes like this. This would be modeled after this is allegedly also very old, but I see prior discussion. But this would have been more of a working class type of ceramic with a rope that would have actually tied it to the tomb. But you would have this filled with water to wash your hands. Then you would have another one with food for the ancestors to consume, and another one with drink for them to have. So the ancestor spirits, the dead, were still very much a viable part of your life. And that also carries forward into the rites and rituals of China. Now, there is one other idea that I need to introduce here. So we've talked about the ancestor spirits, we've talked about Di Tian, we've talked about the animism and the yin and yang and the Tao. The other concept is something called the mandate of heaven. And so that basically means that an emperor who is ruling the land is granted rulership of that land by the gods, by Di, because he's doing a good job. But the second that he stops doing a good job, what ends up happening is that mandate of heaven, that blessing, is removed, and the land goes bad, and there are plagues, and the people are unhappy, and you end up with coups. There are revolts, and who ends up with the mandate of heaven is the one who wins. So the leadership, even on earth, was also still considered to be divinely backed. Now, all of this becomes important because in approximately 1000 BCE, before Common Era, remember that one? So 1000 BC or BCE, China falls apart. So it has this legendary golden age that doesn't last forever. And so China breaks up into states. And there are some leaders within these states that decide they want to be even more powerful and even wealthier. Well, how do you do that in what is essentially a feudal system? Feudalism basically means that the value is in the land. And so essentially, to get more powerful and more wealthier, there we go, you take the land, because nobody ever says, yeah, come on into my property and take it, right? So essentially, there was a power grab. And this sent China into, again, the Warring States period, a ginormous civil war. And this is how things kind of worked. Your nobility were essentially your officers in the army. And if you happened to be poor, you were the cannon fodder. And essentially the nobles would send out their people. They would knock on your door, say, where are your sons, and take them. You were drafted. That was how it worked. Now imagine how this is going to devastate the remainder of the society. So you end up with some very nasty things that happen. China was very male dominated. And so you end up with parents who rely upon their grown sons to keep the farm going and to support them. That support is gone. So you've got a whole generation of elders who are in trouble. Women who depend upon their husbands are essentially widowed. And so that's a problem. And then as we continue on, you end up with children who have no father. And so this is a devastating social issue. I mean, society is just collapsing. And because of that chaos, if you learn nothing else in this class, always remember that social disorder social disruption creates new religions. Okay? I've taught courses called New Religious Movements, and there's always a dissatisfaction with a societal element that begins the movement. In China, we end up with, right around 500, a plethora of philosophies on what to do. And the four primary philosophies, two of whom you are definitely responsible for, which is Confucianism and Taoism. But the four primary philosophies actually end up locked in a battle for a while, which I think is interesting. So you'd end up with Confucianists coming on top and killing off the Taoists, and the Taoists would come back and push back the Confucianists. Then you'd have another group that would come in. And so even the religious philosophies for a while actually fought each other until finally things kind of settled down. But the four philosophies, you had something called legalism or realism. Now, I learned it as legalism, so that's what I usually call it. But it basically said that humans suck, and because of that, we have to have strong rules to keep humans in place, that we are too animalistic to run without rules. So this would kind of skew things heavy towards the government, which is really fairly interesting because, of course, the emperors to be would love this. And there was one emperor, Chindi or Quindi, or depending on how you want to say it, but my accent is always awful and terrible, and I apologize. But he built the Great Wall of China. Not a very nice man, quite paranoid. There goes the puppy. So, all right, children, I know you're excited. Come and see the students. Oh. Haha, that worked. Anyway, he built the Great Wall of China, and he was definitely a legalist. He definitely wanted a very strong legal system, laws to control the people. The second system is almost the opposite of that, and it is, it's called Wahism. Wahism, there we go, and my accent is awful. But it basically meant that humankind runs on love, and that we know that when we benefit others, we benefit ourselves. And of course, that was kind of the weakest argument, didn't go too far. Confucianism actually says that the reason that there are bad people is that there's a bad society, that humans at their heart are noble, and we want to create a noble society to inspire that nobility, to aspire to be better people. All right, we can do this through the use of reason and example. And then the fourth system is Taoism. And Taoism ultimately ends up merging with Confucianism to be two sides to one coin. You're getting used to this now? In which essentially Taoism is about the mystical cultivation of self. All right. We're going to breathe for a second. Confucianism. Here we go. Confucius is quite a fun fellow. I love him because he believed that education actually was one of the answers. And I'm like, oh, that is so sweet. Oh my gosh. Now, he died as an abject failure, so we're going to ignore that for right now. But his story is essentially that his father was a general, a warrior, who actually survived to retire. And his father was supposed to be this great big ugly ox of a man, essentially. The problem is that when he retired, he was given a village, and that's his retirement, because remember, the value's in the land, so he was given a village and some land. And he moved his 2 wives, 9 daughters, and 1 crippled son to this village, but he did not have a healthy son. And in China, a healthy son carries forth the family. So he decided to get a 16-year-old young woman and make her either a lesser wife or a concubine, depending on how you see this interpretation. Ladies, just think about this. He is 70 years old and she is 16. Ancient world, different time. And theoretically, this actually would have been better for her because it would have given her a greater status, which is interesting. It would have pulled her out of kind of the peasant poverty for a while. Well, they, according to the old-fashioned route, she conceived Confucius and gave birth to a son who was healthy, and Daddy was just delighted. Now, the mystical version, the mythical version, is that his mother fell asleep, and in a dream, she met one of these heavenly deities the Black Emperor, one of these very high rulers of the heavens, and had, as they say very politely, had union with him. And when she woke up, she was pregnant. So she was impregnated by a dream of this figure who kind of represents social order. If it's a little more naturalistic, then he is the son of a warlord, which is kind of interesting. He was supposed to be a very ugly baby, but Daddy loved him anyway because he was healthy, and actually did accept him into the family. Confucius never would have answered to the name Confucius. That is actually a Latinized term of his name given to him by the Jesuits in the 1600s. So in the 1600s, the Jesuits are sent by the Pope to go into China to study it. They start translating two books, the books of Confucius and the books of Mencius, one of his, like a later disciple, if you will, who also wrote really cool stuff, but beside the point. And the translation from the Chinese of Kung Fu Tze, Master Kung, became Confucius. So Kung is actually a noble name, and it's fairly important because that's all Confucius got from his daddy, because Daddy died about 3 years after he was born. The family rejected Confucius and his mother in part because all they had was the estate to support 9 daughters, each of whom needed a dowry. Now, in ancient Chinese culture, marriages were arranged, and on top of that, you had to pay the husband's family to take her. A daughter would not be raised to be part of her father's family. She would have been raised to be a part of her husband's family. So marriage was a little bit different, and 9 dowries is expensive. You have 2 widows who likely cannot remarry and a son who cannot work, who they have to draw sustenance. They have to sustain themselves through what is left. So Confucius and his mother go to the city of Lu, where essentially he grows up incredibly poor. He probably did menial jobs to earn money on the side, but he has an understanding of the poor that most noble people do not have. Now, the name Kung becomes important because it ensures that he can get an education. He is entitled to an education, and his mother pushes him to do so. So he's a bit of a mama's boy. He does go into education. It is said that while other children in the system were out playing war games, he stayed in the library and read, and he studied the ancient texts, and he loved them. He loved the idea of united China. He loved the idea of this golden age behavior. So when he is 14 years old, his mother dies. He does marry at the age of 19. It does not appear to be the best marriage because we don't know much about Mrs. Confucius, and there is even a school of thought that says he might have divorced his wife, but not before she gave him a son and a daughter. He and his son did not get along. His son died as a young man, and Confucius kind of buried him and said, "Oh, gee, that's too bad." His daughter, however, does marry one of his disciples, and Confucius actually has a living descendant even today. I think they're at 77 or 78 generations now. Documented generations. That's pretty good. So, what's he do? Well, when he's married, he uses his nobility and his education. He gets a job as the head of a granary, which is kind of like management. So he's like a manager of a bank, maybe. He supports his family for a time, but he just looks at the world and he just sees that it is so wrong. And so he decides that what he wants to do is to go into government. Well, imagine this guy coming up and saying, "You guys are doing it all wrong. You're not going to let him in, right?" This is a civil war period with lots of egos. And so essentially he is not granted a government office, at least not initially. So he says, okay, what is another way to influence people? Through education. And so he actually opens what is essentially the first university. He's kind of a good old-fashioned Renaissance man. He studies a bunch of subjects and he can teach on them, and he is magnificent that way, and I adore him. But he also would have been a real pain in the butt because he would have said, "You have lint on your outfit." There's a story that actually says there was an old man who was sprawled across the ground with his robes flopped open, and Confucius was disgusted and struck him with his cane. And he basically said, you didn't support your family, you are a horrible burden on society, and you don't know when it's time to die. Because the man had no dignity. You have to carry yourself with respect and reflect that you are human on a social level, that you are thinking, that you have, he would have been like a Miss Manners, no elbows on the table, sit with your back straight and your feet together. He would have very much been like that because it's discipline, it's separating us from the animals, and it's elevating us to a more controlled status. So he does this school, and he's rather radical because rich and poor sit together, and they're educated together, and he creates what is essentially a scholarship for poor people who are very smart. And he says, I want you to come to this school not based upon your social rank, but based upon your intellect. This was radical. This was a social upheaval right there. So what Confucius basically begins to teach is that it should be a society, again, based on nobility, on being a noble self, on your ability to be good, right? It should not be nepotism. It should not be your birthright. It should be based upon ability to unlock your potential and be a better person. Also a threat to government at that time. So, what did Confucius teach? Well, he started off basically saying that humanity at its core was not evil, like the legalists were saying, the realists, but that we were truly good. And he says, here's my proof. If you see a child standing on the lip of a well, what would you do? And the answer is you would go and grab that child and pull him to safety. It would not matter if it was your child or not, right? If you see somebody about to fall into the ocean, you try to help them. And he says this is proof that we are good people. But he says, where do bad people come from? Well, bad people come from a bad society. We are a society of overlapping relationships, and the individual is part of that relationship. We are made of these relationships. And in fact, he calls them the 5 relationships. All right, so get your pen out, write this down. Relationship number 1, he says we have to have these things in line together in order for them to work. Relationship number 1 is ruler to subject. He comes up with an idea of a ruler who is something of a yunzi. All right, there are a couple different ways to spell it and pronounce it, but basically what this means is a ruler who is a gentleman, a superior man, who is empathetic, but able to think things through, not emotional, but he can say, I understand where you're coming from, who has a good public face, who is a good father, who is a good husband, right? He's the all-around 90s kind of guy, the one that we are all looking for. Well, if an emperor is a yunzi, he is utilizing something called te. T-E, te. Te is basically power. It is the power and authority of an individual. A good leader uses his power well. When I was younger, I had a job at a place called the Florida Trend. And it was a very interesting job. I worked for the publisher herself, or the editor-in-chief, I guess she was. And it was very challenging because she would have me doing her personal errands for her. I mean, it wasn't a very fulfilling job. It wasn't inspiring. And yet I have worked for people who, they almost are like servant leaders. They are really here for the betterment of society. And when you see that, you want to be better, right? I want to be better, and I want to do my best. So an emperor utilizes te appropriately because he is a yunzi. He uses his power in a good way. He is an authoritarian figure. He is the father to the state. He can say no when he has to. He can say yes when it's appropriate. In return, the subject is loyal. So if a subject is loyal, then the emperor does not have to be putting out military to crush coups, right? He doesn't have to be mean-spirited, and people can get along. Now, how does this affect me as an individual or you as an individual? Well, think about this. What is the most basic background that influences who and what we are? Confucius is right on this. It is the government. Have you met people who come from a different part of the country? Imagine people from California versus people from Mississippi versus people from New York versus people from Texas and versus people from Florida. The backgrounds are similar, but not the same. And the experience, the punishments, the rewards, the tax system, the court system, they're all a little bit different. And they all impact you slightly differently. So a person from California who might tend to be a little bit more liberal in certain ways, going to Mississippi, it might be a bit of culture shock, right? Or from Mississippi to New York. The differences in the subtleness of the background, that governmental background. So the government actually is kind of an all-shadowing background. I always liken it to, hopefully y'all have traveled some as well, but if you ever go to the UK, which, they speak English, there's a lot of similarities between the cultures, but the government is different enough that the culture is different. It's not America, right? America's not England. So, the second relationship is called the cornerstone relationship, and it is the most important according to Confucius. Initially, it was father to son, because again, Confucianism was very masculine in its nature. Later on, with the Neo-Confucian movement that takes place, it becomes parent to child. But the idea is that a parent is the role model and the basis for the child, the individual. They set the household rules. So while the emperor sets the outside rules, the family sets the personal rules. And I'm sure you've heard phrases like the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or it's a bad seed, right? Or people who've had to endure a difficult childhood, and they can turn out in different ways, right? So Confucius basically says a parent, a father, should once again be a good example. And the child, this is tough, the child should obey. A child should be a virtuous follower of the parent. The child should be good so that the parent can be good. Right? It's a very good dichotomous relationship. And if your parent punishes you, you should accept this, because the parent is punishing you out of love. All right? So if your parent sends you to your room because you broke curfew, they're doing it out of love, not out of hate. Right? And that's going to make a big difference. All right, the third relationship, husband to wife. A husband is to be a good man, right? Loyalty. China actually had some rather interesting rules when it came to that sort of thing, and concubines and whatnot, but okay. But a husband should be a good public face, provide for the family, be a good example, be a good husband. I mean, really. Whereas the wife, and this is where half the class goes, oh, wait, what now? A wife should obey. Before we get too upset about that, remember that in Christianity, a husband used to love, honor, and cherish his wife, and the vows for a wife were to love, honor, and obey. Even Paul says there can only be one head of family in Christianity, and that is the father, but the mother is the neck, right? So it's kind of the same idea. The neck turns the head. And so the mother would have internal power to the family, and she would be kind of the iron fist in the velvet glove. Now, as long as I'm pausing here for a second, I will show you these. A lot of people know about the lotus foot. There we go. That was very popular in China. These are actually lotus foot shoes. These are from the 1800s. I do believe that they are legit. But these obviously are not worn, but what would happen is women in China did not have a lot of power, even under the Neo-Confucians. The Neo-Confucians gave women more power by saying if your husband goes off the path of being a superior man, then it is your responsibility to get him back on that path. So women had that kind of power. But In China, around the Middle Ages, an emperor had a foot fetish, and this foot fetish ended up kind of becoming popular. So, literally, if you were a noble woman, or an upper class woman, or even middle class, usually the poor and prostitutes did not have their feet bound. But you would have your foot broken when you were a child. It would kind of, your toes would be forced under, your big toe would come out, and it would be kind of like a lotus in appearance. But literally, they would break your foot in half. It was incredibly painful. Even the explorer Marco Polo wrote about hearing the young girls crying at night because their feet hurt them so badly. If somebody botched this, you would be lame entirely. If you did not have your operation botched, your foot would be between 3 and 5 inches across. This is obviously a 5-inch foot, so it's not quite as set up. But imagine trying to walk if your feet were like this. So again, it was an aspect of beauty, but it was also another way to control women. And the lotus foot actually goes out again with Mao. So when Mao and communism came in, he stopped the foot binding process. But it is actually fairly interesting. Women, again, would sew, and this was kind of a creative outreach for them. Your mother-in-law would actually have a say in whether or not you could marry her son. And she would actually, she had a list of things that she judged you by. Your hips, were you a good childbearer? Your forehead, your intellect, your modesty, your behavior. And again, your ability to sew. So you would create shoes like this or a cloth, and you would embroider it as a symbol of your domestic skill. Ladies, and any of you who are married, imagine this. You would not be raised to be a part of your father's family, but you would be raised to obey your mother-in-law. So once you were married, you would have to get up before your mother-in-law, draw her bath, help her dress, feed her breakfast, and basically obey her. Yeah, it's an interesting one. The other impetus to this is that women would be encouraged to have sons, because if they had a son, they would have a future daughter-in-law to serve them. Okay. So the third relationship is husband to wife. The fourth relationship is elder to younger brother initially, and then it became elder to younger sibling. So I'm an only child, and that totally rocks because I don't have to share anything, so neener neener to the rest of you. But for those of you who are older children, how should you treat your younger sibling? And Confucius said, with a patient understanding, because you have already been through this, and your sibling has not. So you are to guide them, to help them, and to assist them. Younger children out there, how should you treat your elder siblings? You are to respect them and obey them. So your elder siblings are looking out for you. For those of you who do have siblings, I have heard stories of how siblings can actually get you into trouble, or how they can talk you into doing things that you normally would not do. So the power of that sibling relationship is certainly there. In addition to that, because of the notion of the ancestor spirits, one other thing that becomes prevalent and predominant in Chinese culture is something called hesoi. And again, accent sucks, so I apologize. But hesoi basically meant veneration of the elder. The idea is that the older you are, the more wisdom that you have. And think about this, once you become an elder person, what are you about to become? You are about to become an ancestor spirit who's going to guard your family. So how would you treat that elder person? With a great deal of respect and love and obedience. Okay? The final relationship is friend to friend. This is also called Ren or Gen, depending on how you see it spelled. And it basically is the symbol for two people. Confucius does have something called, well, number one, there is something that is essentially the golden mean, the doctrine of the mean, which basically says do not go to either extreme. But he also has something that becomes known as the Confucian well, it's the Confucian golden rule, or the negative golden rule, right? The negation of the rule, which says, do not do unto others what you would not have done unto yourself. Does that sound familiar? And in fact, he would encourage reciprocity with compassion. That's a great phrase. Drop it over dinner. Reciprocity with compassion means to treat others in a compassionate manner. If somebody knocks into you and you simply push them back, they get up and they push you back, and then you hit them and they get up and they hit you. This is not reciprocity with compassion. This is reciprocity with no compassion, and you're going to get World War III. Confucius said to treat others as you wish to be treated. All right? The friend relationship should be one of honor. Now, how in the world does this show up in a religious studies textbook? Well, Confucius encourages two other concepts that I'd like to talk about. One is the concept called li. And li represents rites and rituals. So this is, and probably legit, this is an old drum from about the turn of the 20th century. This would be part of your parade processional. I love this thing. I've had it for a very, very long time, and it's pretty substantial, and you can kind of see how somebody walking in the front of a procession would have this. But li is the rites and the rituals. It is the organization of society. And Confucius never said not to be religious. In fact, he liked community gatherings because they endorsed social order. So Confucius would basically say, participate in rites and rituals, worship, honor the ancestors as you are supposed to. That is part of who we are as humans. He said that rites and rituals were important to our humanity because, unlike animals, humans have these rites and rituals. I have yet to come home to discover that my pugs are going to sacrifice a rat on the altar to the pug god. That doesn't happen. Yet we have the capacity of understanding something greater than ourselves. He also said something along the lines of, I cannot control the heavens. I can only control myself. This acknowledges the heavenly power. And even on his deathbed, he was calling out, will nobody endorse me? Will nobody give me the mandate of heaven? Right? Kind of an interesting thing. The other reason why I love Confucius is that, and he would have liked this too, I think, is that he also believed in a concept called wen, or education. In other words, peaceful education, not archery and the war elements, shooting and whatnot, but he believed in poetry and art and music because they helped us become better. Now, he did teach archery because that is a skill, but he wanted the peaceful arts. And he believed that education made people better. He actually said, when do you stop learning? You stop learning when they put in the final nail to your coffin. I'm like, oh, that is so grim, but awesomely sweet. Thank you, Confucius. Well, I'm sad to say that Confucius and all of his teachings kind of got a mixed reaction. He does have his school. One of the students in his school does ultimately become, I think this is funny, it translates as Duke Ding. His name is, his title is Duke, and the family is Ding, so Duke Ding. Basically says to Confucius, I know you want a position in government. Tell me, how would you advise leadership? And Confucius basically kind of looks at him and says, you cannot control the people until you can control yourself. And it's a little bit of a smack to this leader who was kind of known for his rather rambunctious nature with women. And so Confucius is given, he's given an honorary office, although legend actually says he was made like vice president, vice mayor, right? Deputy mayor. So he was only in government for about 5 years. According to legend, he actually did come up with an idea of welfare and social security in which he actually fed widows, orphans, and elders who lost their male companions or family to the war, the state would feed them one meal a day. This doesn't sound like a lot, but when you have no meals coming in, this was a really radical idea. He also talked about men and women walking on opposite sides of the street, however, and that there's almost this like total segregation. I don't know. I just get the impression maybe he and his wife must have had some sort of very interesting relationship. He was a mama's boy, though, so I don't know. After he gets this political office, after 5 years, there are a couple different stories. One is that his political enemies came together and had charges brought up against him. The other is that he realized that everything that he was trying to do was just honorific and it really was not a serious office. Either way, he leaves government. And for 13 years, he actually begins traveling across China. He is brought into the courts of very many people. He is given audience. He is given awards and money, but he is never given another political office. And after 13 years, he decides to retire. He's about 68 years old at this point, and he spends the last 5 years of his life in semi-retirement. For 3 years, he and his disciples come together, and he edits a book called the Analects. So the Analects has some Confucian ideals, but many of the essays are written by his students, and he pulls these together into a book. As time goes on, he kind of recesses to just really his top 72 disciples. He has a young man, he's 41 years old, but that he is preparing to pass his mantle on to continue this philosophical teaching. And what you know, the young man is brilliant, but dirt poor, and he drops dead, probably of pneumonia. And Confucius is absolutely devastated. I mean, this was his spiritual son, his successor, the one that he saw himself in. And even at the funeral, he openly wept, which is not a very Confucius thing to do. You're supposed to refrain on your emotions. And he went into full reclusion, essentially just visiting with a few. And it is said that for the last year of his life, he suffered from terrible depression, and then he died, thinking that he had failed. And the irony of ironies is that because of his school and because of what he taught, his philosophies are still studied today. They actually lasted in China up through Mao to a certain extent. Mao did keep the part about, government should be a really big and significant part of your life. But he actually made the office of government an honorable office, that you should be educated and able to pass tests, oral traditions, written exams. Your handwriting had to be good, and you should be the best that your area can offer to be in government. Now, as China kind of slipped down, in part due to the last several dynasties, but the 1800s had famine and poor leadership, there were a lot of issues, and essentially it did allow for Mao and communism to come in because the disproportion of power to an elite few and then a very largely suffering and starving population of common people. China today is most likely a hybrid of communism and capitalism. It is having some social issues to overcome. There is a new rise of looking into the traditional stories and the heritage and going back for the antiques and not letting them out of the country. There is a bit of an issue that for a while Chinese families could only have one child, and it was so skewed to the masculine that there were too many boys and not enough girls born. You can actually read accounts of women who are abducted by other men and kind of forced, even though they're married to other people, but they're abducted until they have a child, and then they're released. But because there are simply not enough women, that the population skews more to the masculine. There are also some differences between the way people in the cities are dealt with versus the countries. Cities do seem to get preferential treatment. And of course, the social disorder of no longer venerating the elders in the same way. There are families that are now having to sue their adult children, sons in particular, to come and visit them, because China has begun to really look at young, single, only children, sons who were very heavily adored and got the full focus of the family. And yet at the same time, Mao does industrialize it, and he really brings China up into the 20th century. It was a very difficult transition, but he has made it most certainly a very strong and powerful part of the Asian economic bloc. So kind of an interesting mix. Whew. All right, all the pugs went to sleep, thank God, and I made it through this video. So the next video that we're going to see, and that hopefully I will get to make fairly soon, will be on Taoism. It should be a little bit shorter, as I've explained a lot of background. So I will see you then. Be well.